Hi, this is the Ignoramus's Guide to Surviving Humanity, and I'm Ileana Chan, and I have here um, Ahmed Sharan, who is doing a PhD in political economics, kind of, and behavioral economics, at least in the Wayne State
City.
University in Detroit. Um, so we brought him on because we want to discuss that book, The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. And it was a book that I read and realized I have a lot of ignorance about economics. I definitely need help sort of like trying to figure out just so many terms in that book, like really what she's saying. And also, um, just how does the economy work, basically? That's what I want to figure out because there's so many dissenting voices. Um, so we thought we'd actually talk to someone that was an expert in the field. So we brought on Ahmed. So
Well, thank you very much, Ileana, for having me. First of all, I think it's pretty complex to figure out a solution to the world's economy. So
I'm sure
we'll
I can
try our
handle
best.
it.
We'll try our best to understand as much as and share our thoughts about how the economy works and any questions you might have. But I mean, you're not the only person here who's who thinks they're naive in this field. It's actually a very complex field, and I at times consider myself extremely naive in it. And even though like I have an officially, strong background with degrees and, academic work backgrounds in the field. So yeah, let's just hope that let's make the best out of it and see if we can,
Clarify something.
clarify. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, so basically, the deficit myth is a book that sort of lays out for the layman, I guess, what MMT is, which is modern monetary theory.
Well, in a nutshell, I think it would be considered an unorthodox approach to traditional monetary theory. It's a heterodox theory that, in a nutshell, basically assigns monopoly power to currency. So you have, strong currency here that is, that has um, economic leverage, economic flexibility on the part of a country's central bank. We're talking, with respect to the deficit myth book, it's really referring to a few industrialized economies that
Yes.
operate in a unique way. And the reason why it's considered unorthodox is that the general consensus, the general understanding of economic theory is, the mainstream understanding is one that thinks of deficits as somewhat of a negative outcome and surpluses as somewhat of a positive outcome. And you have the MMT here trying to prove the contrary to this approach,
Yeah.
using
So
the strength of the central bank or an industrialized economy's currency, basically.
okay, so like break this down for us a little bit more because so for me, my understanding about MMT is that like you're saying it only applies to certain countries. It applies to certain like so in layman terms, applies to countries that print their own money. So
Absolutely. And you have more than just one example. The US is definitely a very big example of, a country, a very like an industrialized economy that has, you know, um, a lot of, economic power. So there's the Federal Reserve in the US, which is the United States central bank, and its responsibilities to control money supply and basically in times of recessionary periods, the Federal Reserve has the right to just print money, stimulate the economy without necessarily having to worry about consequences of a devalued currency that has other inflationary repercussions. So it's very much unique to a certain industrialized economies that are strong, well established. In the U.S., the military gives it its standing, and so yeah, I mean, you have an independent central bank that has some sovereignty, and when it comes to currency. So the U.S. dollar is an independent currency. Only the central bank in the U.S., which is the Federal Reserve, has the authority, has the right to issue the currency. And so the government here is the issuer of the US dollar, not any other government. Only the Federal Reserve, which is the US government,
So when you
can.
think of so when you think of MMT in terms of the US, that's just really a description of how their economy works, right? Like why is a pushback on that idea? Because that's literally what happens. Like you have
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, it's those are very technical, econ themes that we're discussing. And if we were to assume that, and I'm not saying, okay, let's just to make things convenient here, how many people are formally educated in any country in the U.S.? Let's take the U.S. as an example.
right.
What's the percentage of university degree holders as a percentage of the overall population's maybe less than 30%? And how many of those have backgrounds in economics? And how many of the ones with a background
Yeah,
in
but
economics?
I'm not even talking about those people. I'm talking about the people that go on the media. Like I was listening to an interview with Larry Summers, and he's one of the economic advisors, I think, of the Obama admin or Bush, and basically he's come up into prominence again because they were thinking of putting him into the Biden admin. But he was basically like his buzzwords are like it's a cute theory, but it doesn't take into account arithmetic. That's literally a quote from him. He's saying that MMT people don't take into account arithmetic. But according to this book, it's nothing. It's not like the U.S. economy is like a household budget. Like she's trying to say, it really isn't at
That's
all.
it. Yeah, that's right. It's not, because we can't expect a government budget is, not treated the same way that a household budget is. We'd like to think, but that's what I'm saying. Like there's this common, I would say rampant, misunderstanding of how, a government, like what defines a government budget, like, and it's an inaccurate understanding, because you can't have a government, carry out its finances the same way you and I do as members of a household, right? So when for us, it's like we're meant to spend as households. I'm saying we're meant to spend within our means, right? Or else we're in debt, we're in trouble, and there might be negative consequences of that behavior. So we can understand that from a household perspective, but from a government perspective, even though like you still have an overwhelming part of the general population that tends to favor financial conservatism, because or like limit deficits and maybe like work on promoting surpluses. But that's not the way that it works, because deficits are not necessarily a negative outcome. That's what it's very important that people know the deficits are just like they're economic phenomena. They're neither negative nor positive, really. I mean, you could argue, you could still argue that they're positive. It's just that you might find that running a budget deficit for your economy at a particular period of time works in favor of all constituencies within a market, within an economy. So it's very important. Okay, so the clear-cut difference is that when you're as a government and you're issuing currency to stimulate the economy, because you have certain goals. And what are your goals? Generally your goals are focused on creating jobs, because you want to achieve full employment, right? So, and you can do that with printing currency in the U.S. without necessarily having to worry about, being in trouble or like going bankrupt. They're saying, oh no, deficits were once, we're gonna, reach that bankruptcy point, and we're gonna be in trouble, and that's not going to happen, because there's, as I said, sufficient economic leverage there, that those central banks of industrialized economies exercise. And yeah, you could use a deficit to stimulate an economy. You're printing your own currency, and so it's debt in your own currency. And
But you kind of so instead of the household budget where it's like you have the money already and then you take the money and that's how you pay for stuff. The way the government works, okay, my understanding of it is you decide what you need to buy or pay for or whatever, and then you can print that money.
yeah, you could print that money pretty easily, because
You have the
you're
central bank.
exactly.
So,
And
so
so,
at what point, because the other thing she said was that when there's a deficit, because you're printing the money after you've decided what you're paying for, basically, the deficit, she keeps saying this thing, which I confused me a little bit, which was basically deficit, the money for the deficit goes somewhere. It's not like you suddenly have a vacuum. She keeps saying, like,
oh, absolutely.
yeah, so what, break that down for me, because I got a little confused by that idea. It's like when they're talking about the deficit,
Sure. So,
what are they referring to? Where is the deficit that they're referring to?
right. So, I mean, look at it this way. So, if we're, what's a deficit? What's,
So
it's
like
a
a
mere,
deficit from a layman's, like from me who don't doesn't know anything, right? Like when I was thinking of deficit, it was like, okay, so I owe someone money. Like if $10 is my deficit, that's because I bought something that cost $100 and I could only pay $90. So now I have a deficit of $10. Is
right.
that
So, to
right?
answer your question, I think that $10 example of a deficit is nothing more than a mere contribution to other sectors in the economy. So, I mean, when you think about it, how do you get to that how did you get to that $10 deficit? Isn't it a mere difference between what the government what the government taxes and the amount that the government spends in the economy and what it can subtract from taxation? How did you
Is
like
it
it's a
really? Because that's
that's
the
what
other
she
thing that I think the thing that she's saying is that taxation really is kind of a separate issue. It's almost like she makes the case that I think it was FDR or Roosevelt. I mean, I'm so bad at this, but basically the idea that they understood that if people were taxed on something, that they would invest in what they were being taxed on. Like it was a way to shift people's interest into what was being, like, if they're being taxed for infrastructure, then suddenly they have some sort of investment in the idea of like infrastructure, like, oh, we're building these roads. But in actual fact, that's not how the governmental budget works. It's not like you take taxes from this person and then you can pay for this, because she's kind of saying that that's not necessary at all, because you can just print that money.
sure, yeah, but I think like she might have given an example of, well, first of all, we need to define what a fiscal what a fiscal budget deficit is. I think that those are important terms because fiscal here is, associated with taxation and spending. So a fiscal budget deficit is a mere difference between the amount of money that a government spends in the economy and what it can subtract from taxation. And I feel like that $10 gap, whatever that she was referring to in her book, is in reference to, she gave a hypothetical example, but that was reference to the level of deficit in the economy, and like she was trying to argue that and say that it is money spent on other aspects and it's not money taken away from households. It's money, it's money that is being spent and invested in other parts of the economy. And so like when you invest in a deficit, you're not necessarily taking money away from
You're just spending money. So the deficit is really, so really you're saying the deficit, the definition of the deficit in this case is the money you spent that's not covered by taxation.
absolutely, yeah, that's exactly. And I guess that was the point of her book, is that it's a deficit myth. People consider deficits to be some sort of a financial burden on the economy as a whole, right? But she's coming
Interesting.
with this. She's coming from this unorthodox, heterodox approach, saying the contrary. That no, benefits are a mere tool to control and regulate the economy, maybe stabilize it, because your goal as an economy is really to get people to work, so that
Right.
everyone who's looking for
She
a
did
job,
mention that.
everyone who's willing to work can actually work. So if you have full employment, then you could use, if you have full employment, then, people are happy, they have jobs, the economy is stabilized, and you might have referred to deficit policies in order to get to that full employment position. So full employment is really, because we're humans, we're physical units, in an economic framework, we're physical units and we're real variables. Those are like pure macro terms that just
I would understand.
remembered teaching macroeconomics. But so yeah, that's basically what it is. You're trying to achieve full employment, and you're utilizing fiscal and monetary policy in order to achieve the particular goal that you have in mind, which for many countries, I guess it's the prosperity of an economy lies within the strength of the labor market, right? And unemployment is a very important theme here in any economic thinking. So the reason why she called it a deficit myth is that she's trying aggressively and passionately to refute mainstream thinking that works against or discourages that type of mindset, discourages deficits. And she used a very good example when referring to the Clinton years, when the government was actually operating at a for the first time in a very long time, the US government had a budget surplus for over like 4 years, from the years 98 until 2001 and 2002. And what was interesting about that is that there you had the opposite. You had a surplus, so it was the money, the $10 that was left there circulating in other parts of the economy was actually taken away from them. And people think that surpluses are a positive outcome, but not necessarily, right? So it all depends. So this notion that division, and we like to categorize and think right and wrong because it's easier to think right and wrong. But that's not how you stipulate economic policy, because it's the grayer aspects are a lot more complex, and it's like you have to figure out a solution that works best for you as a government, given your period of time. And we have varying periods of time and different circumstances that govern our decision making. And so like this notion that surpluses are positive while deficits are negative is discredited by her deficit myth book.
So what happens when there is a surplus? You're saying during the Clinton years, what happened when there was a surplus to the average person?
So basically, the government. The government was richer on the part at the expense of other aspects of the economy. And I'm just like referring to her perspective here, because it's still the $10, $100, $90, right? Where
Right.
in this case, yeah, in this case, the government received more in taxation than it had invested, than it had spent.
That is really terrible in that case, because that means that they could have really, like, there was nothing stopping them from actually having all the programs that could have greatly helped America, like now, for example, like a Medicare for all. They could have easily had those systems in place because they had a surplus, meaning they were making more money. They should have actually gone into a deficit and used that money. Is essentially.
But remember, economics and political science are very much interconnected and intertwined. And so, to answer your questions, I guess we would need to ask the policymakers who were there at the time. But yeah,
like logically, they just didn't have any excuse, did they? I mean, like, they're gonna come up with excuses. Like, one of the, I think, things that they always bring up when they want to say why you can't have Medicare for all or whatever, even though it actually costs less. But say that's one of their reasons. You can't have it because future generations are going to have to pay for it. Because if there's a deficit, they're saying that the deficit is going to be paid by future generations.
Yes.
Not
but
that.
Yeah, but I mean, right. But the general public is likely to take that premise, believe right? That. And believe that.
Because what actually happens with the deficit is they're spending more than their taxes, but that can last really forever. There's never a point in which some imaginary econ god goes, balance the budget completely now, you owe me this deficit amount.
Absolutely.
And if the econ god did that, they could just print the money.
Absolutely. So I guess yes. So there are limits, as to how far you could go in the process of printing money. But you
We're
really
not
want to
nowhere
have.
near the limit, is
Oh,
basically.
absolutely. So the goal here is to try and keep the economy in perspective, right? You don't want an inflationary
So
period kicking in
how
because
much would it take to actually um oh, there's I have two questions about inflation because that confused me too. One is basically what does it actually take to actually create inflation? Because that's the other thing that people bring up a lot. They're like, if you have a deficit, you're going to have inflation. Like,
no, not necessarily.
so what does it take
No,
to get to inflation?
I mean, inflation basically, it's an overall rise in the price level. So if your demand patterns are extremely aggressive and there's, more demand in your economy than that can outpace the productive capacity of one's economy, then you will have inevitable inflation. But, and that, it's a good point you said, but when do we get to that point? I mean, there is no time frame. There's no set time frame,
Or a
and it varies
set
depending.
limit?
No, yeah, and it varies, from one country to the other. You could have, surpluses. You know, you could have period. Surpluses could be associated with inflation. What did you say? Like deficits? People are worried that with a deficit, that the future generations are going to have inflationary periods.
No, there's like a few things for the critics of MMT. I mean, we're specifically talking about the US because you're right. MMT doesn't apply to like a country that doesn't print its own money. So
Yeah.
these critics are quite clever. They usually do bring up countries that don't print their own money, like Greece. They'll be like, "Look what happened to Greece. We can't let that happen to the US," which is like Greece didn't
Yeah, but
print
the
their
U.S.
own
and
money.
Greece are separate. You
So
can't.
different. Yeah, so that's just like a completely bad faith argument. But the other two that confused me a little was one was about inflation. They're like, if you have a deficit, if you make the deficit bigger by investing in your country, basically, is what I'm thinking, is that you're going to at some point have inflation.
I don't think that that's going to necessarily affect the U.S. economy. Look, you're investing in the economy for a reason, right? So
Yes.
you're using this deficit for a reason. You are suffering from recessionary pressures. People are not working, and you have the capacity. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
like your overall capacity is stronger in magnitude than than what is actually taking place because people are not working. So you want to utilize that deficit and want to make it work in your favor to where like each and every individual who can work and is willing to work ends up getting that job because there is that productive capacity. So once you go beyond productive capacity, then we could say, well, okay, then we could be confronted with inflationary measures, but you could always work around it and create additional
And
productivity and
also,
invest in research and development to where there is, you increase your own capacity to produce as a
yeah.
country.
So that's the part that really, like, for example,
Yeah,
just completely makes no sense to me because that criticism, from the way that you're explaining it to me about what deficit is, you never ever have to have a situation where, like, where your demand exceeds your supply if you're continually looking to the future and continually investing in your
absolutely.
country.
Absolutely. But you
So
have to be investing in the right places,
right. So you
which is,
can't be investing. And what would you say would be a really ridiculous thing to invest in?
I
Because it would be
mean,
something that wouldn't create jobs, it wouldn't create products,
I
it
would
wouldn't create opportunities.
I would be eager to invest in real variables, like that are
Infrastructure,
associated. Exactly. Infrastructure,
healthcare.
education, healthcare, research and development, things that could guarantee you a healthy labor for a healthy market for a long period of time ahead. It's a long term way of thinking.
So,
So
which ways do you think, like, sometimes I hear a lot of like, oh, this government or that government spent unwisely, like they were very frivolous in their spending. So, in those cases, what would you say? What would be the things that they would be spending on that would be considered frivolous or that would be objectively frivolous?
Like, are you talking about the US in particular, or like in general?
I think in general, because I can't really think of anything in the US which would be frivolous from what we're talking about. Like, I just see so many issues in the US that can be addressed by spending. I mean, the infrastructure is terrible. So, like, I can definitely
Yep,
see
I was having
how
a
you could.
conversation the other day with a friend from Chicago, and yeah, you're right. I mean, like some of the roads are not of good quality, and
Terrible.
yeah, so infrastructure spending. Yeah, I mean, I can't think of like an area where where you could spend when you could have wrongful spending, especially
I
like
I can think of one now suddenly because I was thinking of the LA budget and how terrible the infrastructure in LA is, the potholes everywhere, et cetera, no public transport, et cetera. But then it came out that they had like 56% of their budget was on the police. And so that's
was
where
that
I'm like,
what?
on the police. The
Uh-huh.
police had 56% of their budget. So in that case, like, oh yeah, you have like military weapons for your police that's supposed to be community for your community, policing your community. So those things I would say is not the right. I mean, that's why defund the police.
Yeah, that's. I
But
mean, if you,
I
yeah.
still don't know. I mean, so morally, I would say don't spend that much on the police. Like, there's no reason to have like a million helicopters, but I still don't think that creates inflation. Like in terms of not like talking about it morally, but just talking about it completely economically, even that doesn't create inflation, right? If you just spent more and more on the police, that wouldn't create any inflation.
Well, yeah, police officers are employees, right? So
They
it's
pay
labor.
taxes.
They pay taxes and they're contributing to the economy. I mean, if we want to look at it from a humanitarian perspective, maybe investing so much spending on national defense, but even national defense is a huge employer. And so depending on what perspective you want to look at it, from, I guess, I would say I'm totally against foreign aid, investing like,
Right.
increasing the foreign aid budget, because what it does, I don't think it empowers the recipient countries. It just creates more of a
I
political
mean, if it
divide,
came with
strengths
no
wise between
strings,
between the donor and the recipient.
yeah, and we know
So,
that it comes with strings. There's always some sort of something associated with it. It's not just free money.
oh no, it's not. Definitely
Yeah.
not. No, no, it's
So it's
not.
just
It's not.
another
And
way
it,
to control.
yeah, no, and it's very much independent of economic development in the recipient countries. But unfortunately, it's been growing exponentially in recent, in the last decades or so, especially with certain countries. And I don't think it helped, empower those countries, nor make their people, wealthier per se.
I mean, I think really it shouldn't be called foreign aid. That's a marketing term, isn't it? Because they're just like pretending to help those countries when really it's got nothing to do with that.
But I
So,
mean, you could use. I mean, you said it earlier. Deficit could be also like another marketing term.
right.
To mislead the general public. And I bet you anything, if you were to carry out a survey and ask people what they think of what they think a deficit is, a positive outcome or a negative outcome, I think the vast majority would probably say negative, right?
Definitely. I mean, definitely. And also, it's used here all the time. Like, I'm in London, and it's just used here all the time to promote austerity. Like, it's used here to cut the budget of the NHS. This is like,
Yep.
we have to be worried about the deficit. We can't, like, as a government, etc. And it's just like
And they
we're
tell you it's not
discussing.
sustainable.
Yes, they
And
always say it's not sustainable, but from our conversation, it just sounds like
no, there's actually
it doesn't make any sense.
there's history to discredit this idea or belief. I mean, look at the UK's budget right after the Second World War, how it was, you know, uh, the deficit or whatever debt was twice the country's income, and clearly it survived for many years after, and now
Yeah,
now
because a lot of
now it's
programs were started at that time. A lot of our sort of social net programs were started at that time. And probably we would say, I think that was the birth of the labor movement. So so we would say
UK is
all.
definitely another example. So it's the US, not just the US, the UK has that power too. Canada does, Australia, Japan.
Okay, so Yeah, so so basically you just convinced me that there is no reason that we can't have all the nice things. Basically, we can have infrastructure, we can have healthcare, we can
Yeah,
we can have education.
yeah,
There's
of
like
course
no
we can.
actual reason to not have
I
those
mean,
things.
I mean, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has probably worked in favor of Kelton's works because it just goes to prove modern monetary theory. You know, now
Yes.
the governments of such economies felt the pressure to spend because of a COVID. But really, they don't necessarily need something as drastic and as catastrophic as a COVID-19 international pandemic to take that route and pump in the money. You see what I mean?
No, they don't at all. And that's, I think, what's confusing is it definitely proves it in terms of where did they suddenly get, like, what was the first one? $6 trillion? Oh, suddenly they just had that, just handily in their pocket. But they still, like this past week, they've still come out with the messaging. How are we going to pay for that? They keep saying that over and over again so that the average person is just thinking, how are we going to pay
Well,
for it?
yeah, I mean, sure, because the average person is usually the victim here of, you know, bigger political economic plans. You know, the average person does not get to decide their fate, right? To an extent, they don't. You know,
No, I don't think they do. And I think I mean, my personal belief is that there is too much emphasis on how much choice, especially looking at the US and living in the US. There's just so much emphasis on choice when really the average person does not have choice in terms of their healthcare. Like, there's no real choices, just really terrible choices. So,
but I mean, let's just go by your personal aspirations here, and like I sense that you're very much in favor of investing in real sectors that are of economic and human value, like education, research, and healthcare, right? And let's just say that we have your scenario, and then what do you think will happen with time? You will have an empowered, you know, population, not just like everywhere. If all countries, and I guess that's not necessarily in political alignment with the overall, set plan for how this world should function.
well,
It's
yeah,
yeah.
because
So
ultimately they don't want empowerment of their people, right?
yeah,
I mean, I
yep.
guess that's what they
I
do.
mean, that's a personal opinion, and yeah,
I mean, that's what I'm seeing is that their way of controlling the narrative is to say you can't, it's your fault you're poor, for example. It's your fault you don't have healthcare or whatever. And really we can't pay for it because life is like that. Life is just sucks and we can't if we give you healthcare, then your grandkids will starve to death or something. Like, there's that ridiculous idea that they keep perpetuating. And now I just hear it over and over with the Biden admin. They keep saying that thing of how is he going to pay for it? He just wants to make sure he can pay for it. He just, that's what they were saying over and over again. And so they're making all these cuts to the infrastructure bill, to like everything that they're proposing. They're just making it as small as possible. And then when you look at it, like infrastructure, it's like I think 2.7 trillion was what I heard. The last figure I heard over 10 years is I don't think that's even 1 year what China is spending on their infrastructure. So it's like if you're trying to compete with China and they're saying that China is a credible threat to them, that's not how you compete. You don't compete by spending so much less, in terms of your investments in your
oh,
country.
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, China definitely has a cutting advantage in this case because first of all, it invests heavily in U.S. Treasury bonds, and it
That's what I
spends. You're
wanted
right.
to. That's what I wanted to ask you too. That's another thing that I was confused about in the book because she talks about because there is like again for me hearing about we would hear like the U.S. owes China like $750 trillion or something like that, like a huge amount of money. Um, and she was basically like saying it's really not like it because it's all computerized right now. It's more like a balance sheet rather
Yeah.
than actual money, first of all. And also, it's I couldn't understand this, but basically, it's like a balance sheet which allows China to have credit with the US or something like that. Can you explain that a
Yeah, I
bit?
mean, China is a very important trading partner, right, for most countries, including the U.S. So their Chinese products are ubiquitous; they're everywhere in the world. And when Chinese products are sold in the U.S., the U.S. consumers pay for them, and Chinese companies make money, so they have dollars, right? Because the U.S. consumers pay in dollars, right? So now the Chinese companies have dollars that they end up investing in U.S. Treasuries. So that's basically that's like that's the debt. But it's not necessary again, but it's not necessarily good or bad for either one party. It depends on like it could be both a good thing for the U.S. and China. I don't see it as much of a threat because I don't think that the Chinese will withdraw their investments anytime from the U.S.'s economy because they're every bit as reliant on the U.S. as the U.S. is relying on them. So it's they're two big superpowers, important trading partners, and if China were to suddenly withdraw its investments from the U.S. economy, what do you think will happen to the U.S. dollar? It would probably risk losing much of its value, and that could have severe negative consequences for the entire world. I mean, you can only think of the economic shockwaves that such action could leave. And China's economy could be devastated too because when you have shockwaves all over and Chinese economies are no longer competitive.
Right.
What sets apart China as a intensive, heavily export intensive economy. It's their products are of relatively inexpensive value. There people can have easy access to Chinese products. So if that happens and the US drops in value significantly, they're not going to be as competitive and they're going to sell less, and China will be affected in a bad way.
Right.
So yeah, so I really don't get this. I think they're both again they both economies depend on one another. I don't think they work separately. You see what I mean? So I don't consider China as a threat. I
Yeah, I
I
mean, I don't know why China's considered a threat apart from the fact that like Biden actually said like I think last week that we're not gonna not on my watch is China going to overtake the US. And I think it's just purely this idea of
yeah,
um
I remember that statement. It
right?
just
It just was
said,
like
but
overtake
well,
how? What
like
in
I
what
know I
way?
remember like reading and I said like, what can you do? What can you do about it? Like it's not your say.
Well, I guess that's the thing. That's where you get into all this like CIA stuff. but but without that, like just like purely on the idea of like how it just didn't make sense to me that the way in which he was going to battle China was just to badmouth China versus to invest in his own country. Essentially, like what we're talking about, because that's really the way to beat China would be like heavily invest in your infrastructure, education, healthcare, in your people.
That's what the
And
Chinese are doing right now, more so than any other country.
yeah,
Yeah.
very obviously
I mean,
doing
and
it.
look at it in a matter of what, 30 years, the Chinese have come a long way,
Yeah.
and their GDP per capita is growing again exponentially. So you just look at, the facts and the statistics. It's incredible
So,
from
but
having
what
been.
about just sort of the idea of do we have to? I was listening to a podcast recently again with Stephanie Kelton, and it was this idea of do we always measure, do we have to measure progress of the country or the success of the country purely via growth?
No,
Like,
no, 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 no. By economic growth, you mean?
yeah, economic growth.
Nope. There's other, I mean, economic growth, it just means, how productive your economy is in terms of gross domestic product, from one year to the other. If you're growing, if your economy is expanding and there's more production, but that doesn't give you any idea about the level, the level of income distribution, social political freedoms in any country, it's just a mere number, right? So you could have, you could again have, you could have an improving gross domestic product from a nominal perspective, but then does that translate into a better standard of living for, or overall better well-being for people in the country? No. You have other factors. I mean, there's the HDI, Human Development Index, which takes into account literacy rates as well as a life expectancy and and income levels. And there's just, yeah, there's more to look into than
Because
just
that's
like,
the other thing that I hear a lot of. It's like, oh well, you don't want your economy to slow down. Like China's growth is going to slow down. Japan's growth has been stagnant for years, And I just am like, well, how important is that actually? Like I can't figure it out.
well, there's nominal growth and there's real growth. So there's depends, like growth can be very misleading. You have an economy, okay, just to say, oh, an economy has been experiencing growth. In what terms? There's nominal terms. You could look at an oil exporting, country that, relies heavily on oil exports, and all of a sudden you have an economic oil boom and the price of a barrel of oil skyrockets. And then you have that country making, a lot of money all of a sudden. It doesn't necessarily mean I think your question here is the human side of it, better or worse for, the average human being. But
Yeah, in
it's
terms of
very
better work.
complex. I mean, it's very complex. Who knows? I mean, if you're in a country that operates on the basis of inequality and indoctrination, the rule of one person, or just, I don't think more money will mean anything. I mean, it could be, I don't know, temporary silence. Uh,
So the
for
idea of like China's GDP growth is slowing down. Like, is that really cause for alarm? Because I think like we're told these things as narratives, and it's supposed to be scary or
No, I don't think it should be scary. I mean, like the economy is a cycle, right? So there's the ups and downs, and it's natural, it's normal. So I don't think it's alarming. Now, if the average citizens, if the average Chinese citizens are experiencing an all of a sudden drastic decrease in their overall standard of living, then yes, you would be alarmed, right? But just because you're temporarily going through an economic slowdown doesn't mean that you're necessarily alarmed per se. You could always figure out the right strategies, economic solutions to help your economy recover too.
well, basically this book is about macroeconomics. She's a macroeconomist.
Is That's her area of expertise. Yeah, for the most part, it is. And but it's actually a very interesting literature, because I like that twist. I like literature that can make you think about things that you've traditionally taken for granted as whatever, right or wrong, and then you all of a sudden have a completely different way of understanding them. Because I tend to be personally interested in behavioral economics, and that's exactly what behavioral economists do. They try to challenge and oftentimes discredit traditional economic perception
So
theories,
is
and by taking into account psychological, emotional, and other factors into perspective. So I feel like maybe the author would also get along with a lot of behavioral economists. I'm not sure, but you can ask her.
I would love to. But so basically, it's behavioral economist, economics. Oh my gosh, I can't speak.
Behavioral economics, behavioral economists. Mhm.
Is it, for example, what we brought up before about if you tax um, certain people a certain amount, it sort of like psychologically makes them invest in something. Is it that sort of idea?
Sure, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it can be because it's a field. First of all, it's a relatively new subfield of economics, and but it's growing, and there's a lot of works in behavioral econ that challenge the general perceptions of traditional economic theory, how we're always taught that people are rational, people make rational choices, and but that's what we're taught in traditional econ classes, right?
Okay.
I mean, the marginal
Really?
analysis, yes, 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 and the marginal analysis framework, where people are rational choices, and they make decisions based on a cost benefit analysis. But a lot of times, even this mere cost benefit analysis framework is flawed because, again, of miscalculations, and behavioral econ is basically a field that incorporates the psychological, as you said, emotional, and other factors
Interesting.
into that process of decision making.
Thank you so much. This is really informative to me. I think I learned a lot. Well, thank you so much. I really
You're
appreciate the
welcome.
conversation. And yes, have a good day.
The Ignoramus's Guide to Surviving Humanity is available as a podcast on Spotify and Amazon Music.
You can also like and subscribe to our videos on YouTube. And if you want to help us grow, then you can become a patron on Patreon. And that's it, right? I think that's it.
Yeah.